If 7 experts can't fix a $200 million problem, maybe the problem isn't the market, maybe it's the experts. The words didn't exist yet in the room, but the tension did. Thick as the polished oak table stretching across the 42nd floor of Cole Dynamics headquarters in Manhattan, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed a gray winter skyline, and silence pressed heavier than the storm clouds outside. Ethan Cole stood at the head of the table, his posture still, his expression unreadable, the red projection behind him pulsing like a warning sign. Loss. $200 million. The number didn't blink, didn't soften it. Just sat there, unapologetic, while 7 executives in tailored suits shifted in their seats, each one holding a tablet, a pitch deck, a last attempt at control. One by one they had spoken, confident voices layered with jargon and forecasts. We pivot the pricing model. We restructure the rollout timeline. We double down on premium positioning. Each solution sharper than the last, each one sounding expensive, impressive, and completely disconnected from reality. Ethan had listened to every word without interruption, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, eyes scanning not just their slides but their faces, measuring something they didn't even realize was being tested. And then, after the final executive finished, after the last rehearsed sentence echoed into nothing, Ethan exhaled slowly and said, "None of this will work." The room froze, not dramatically, not loudly, just a subtle tightening, like a string pulled too far. Someone cleared their throat, another glanced at their colleague, waiting for someone else to speak, to challenge, to recover, but no one did, because they knew that tone. They knew what it meant when Ethan didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't negotiate. It meant he had already decided. Outside, the wind pushed lightly against the glass. Inside, the air felt colder, heavier, a quiet kind of pressure that made even seasoned executives sit a little straighter, a little smaller. The door at the far end of the room clicked softly, almost unnoticed, and a young woman stepped in, balancing a tray of coffee cups, her uniform simple, dark, practical, her movements careful, precise, as if she had practiced being invisible. Maya Johnson kept her eyes lowered, not out of fear, but out of habit, because rooms like this weren't built for people like her, not for someone who took 2 buses to get to work, not for someone who measured time in shifts and tips instead of quarterly returns. She moved along the edge of the table, placing each cup exactly where it belonged. Black for Mr. Harris, oat milk latte for Ms. Klein, double espresso for Mr. Reynolds. She had memorized their preferences without ever being asked, a quiet system of survival, unnoticed efficiency in a world that never looked twice. Just set it down and close the door. One executive muttered without looking at her, his voice flat, dismissive, like she was part of the furniture. Another added under his breath, not quite whispering, not quite caring. She wouldn't understand any of this anyway. A faint ripple of amusement passed between 2 of them, subtle, contained, but sharp enough to be felt. Maya didn't react, not outwardly. She finished placing the last cup, but as she turned, her eyes flicked briefly toward the screen, toward that red number, toward the words scattered across the slide: market, segmentation, user acquisition cost, retention curve, phrases she had heard before in passing, words that sounded important but felt distant. Except this time, something didn't sit right, something in the way they talked about the product, about the target user, about behavior and demand. It felt off, like describing a place you've never actually been. She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to register the disconnect. Then she moved toward the door again, because that was the rule. Enter quietly, leave quickly, don't exist longer than necessary. Behind her, one of the executives tried again, voice tighter now. If we adjust the messaging, we can reposition the brand perception within 90 days. Ethan didn't respond. He was still looking at the screen, but his mind wasn't on the slide anymore. It was on the gap, the invisible space between what was being said and what was real. He had built his company by trusting instincts others ignored, by listening where others talked, and right now, all he heard was noise, rehearsed, polished, empty. Maya's hand reached the door handle, fingers brushing the cold metal, and then she paused again, because the thought wouldn't leave, because it was too simple, too obvious once you saw it. And yet no one in that room had said it. Not one of the 7 people paid 6 figures to understand the problem. Her heart beat a little faster, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of crossing a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. She knew how this worked. You don't interrupt. You don't speak unless spoken to. You definitely don't challenge people who don't even see you. But still, she turned slightly, just enough for her voice to carry, soft but clear. Maybe the problem isn't the market. The words slipped into the room like a crack in glass, small, unexpected, and instantly impossible to ignore. 7 heads turned. Slow, synchronized, confusion first, then irritation, then disbelief. Excuse me. One executive said sharply, but Maya didn't look at him. She was looking at the screen, at the numbers, at the gap no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Maybe it's that none of you actually use the product. Silence didn't fall. It hit. Heavy, immediate, absolute. Even the city outside seemed to disappear for a moment. Ethan's eyes lifted from the screen to her, really looking at her for the first time. Not the uniform, not the tray, but the person, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not surprise, something sharper, more focused, like recognition. Like he had just heard the first honest sentence in a room full of experts. And no one moved, no one spoke. Because in that single moment, the balance of the entire room had changed, and none of them knew what would happen next. No one moved. Not even the executives who had spent years mastering how to recover a room. Because this was not a mistake they could reframe or a comment they could ignore. It was too simple, too direct, and worst of all, it felt true. Mr. Reynolds let out a short breath, shaking his head as if to dismiss the moment. That is completely inappropriate, he said, his voice tightening as he turned toward Maya. You are not part of this discussion. Another executive added quickly, eager to restore order. You do not have the context or the data to understand what we are dealing with here. The words came fast now, layered with controlled irritation, the kind that hides embarrassment. Please leave the room. Someone else said, sharper this time, as if volume alone could erase what had just been said. Maya's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the door. She had expected this, maybe not the exact words, but the reaction, the dismissal, the immediate need to put her back in her place. She nodded once, almost instinctively, because that was what she had learned to do. Step back, disappear, let the moment pass. But before she could turn the handle, Ethan spoke. Wait. It was not loud, but it cut through everything. The room stilled again. The executives shifted, confused now, uncertain which direction this was going. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Maya, steady, analytical, not unkind, but not soft. Either, say that again, he said, and for a second, Maya hesitated, because this was not part of the script. There was no safe version of this moment, no guarantee of how it would end, but there was also something in the way he asked, not dismissive, not mocking, just direct, like he actually wanted to hear the answer. She turned back slightly, her voice still quiet, but clearer now, more certain. I said, maybe the problem is not the market. She glanced briefly at the screen, then back at him. Maybe it is that none of you actually use the product. A faint scoff came from the far side of the table. That is absurd, Ms. Klein said, leaning forward. We have extensive user data, surveys, analytics, focus groups. She gestured toward the slides as if they were proof enough. We understand our customers. Maya did not respond immediately. She looked at the screen again, at the charts, the curves, the projections. Then she said something that shifted the air again. When was the last time you used it yourself? Silence followed. Not because they did not hear her, but because the answer was not ready, not rehearsed. Mr. Harris adjusted his tie. That is not relevant, he said, but his tone lacked the earlier confidence. We are not the target demographic. Maya nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the point, but then she asked, then how do you know it actually works the way you think it does? The question hung there, simple, uncomfortable, the kind that does not need volume to land. One of the younger executives shifted in his seat, glancing at his tablet as if the answer might be written there. Ethan's expression did not change, but his focus sharpened. He leaned back slightly, folding his arms. Keep going, he said, and this time, no one interrupted him. Maya took a small breath, steadying herself. You are all talking about what people should want, she said, choosing her words carefully, but not what they actually do. She pointed gently toward one of the charts. This assumes people will follow a process, step by step, but they do not. They skip, they forget, they get frustrated. She paused, then added, I know because I tried it. That caught them off guard, more than the earlier sentence, because now she was not just questioning the strategy, she was inserting herself into the equation. You tried it, Mr. Reynolds repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. You are not our user. Maya met his gaze for the first time, not challenging, just honest. Maybe not the one you designed it for, she said. But I am the one you are actually getting. A faint ripple moved through the room again. This time not amusement, but something closer to unease. Because that distinction mattered more than they wanted it to. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table. What happened when you used it? He asked, and the question was different from the others, not defensive, not dismissive. It was curious, and that changed everything. Maya shifted her weight, setting the empty tray down quietly on a side table, as if committing to the moment fully now. I got stuck on step 3, she said. It asked for information I did not have, and there was no clear way to skip it or save progress. She glanced at the screen again. Your data probably shows a drop-off there. One of the analysts instinctively looked down at his tablet, scrolling quickly, his eyes narrowing. There is a dip, he said slowly, almost to himself. Around that point. No one acknowledged him, but everyone heard it. Maya continued. And the instructions assume people have time to figure it out, she added. But most people do not. They are doing this between other things, on their phone, in a hurry. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, so they quit. The word landed heavier than any statistic, because it was not theoretical, it was real, lived, immediate. Mr. Harris opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, because there was nothing in his slides that addressed that exact moment, that exact experience. Ethan's gaze moved briefly to the screen, then back to Maya, connecting the dots faster than anyone else in the room. And if they quit, he said slowly, we lose them. Maya nodded. Not just them, she said. They tell other people it is not worth it. The room felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, but unsettled, like something foundational had shifted. The confidence that had filled the space earlier was thinning, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. And Ethan saw it. He saw the gap between polished strategy and actual behavior, between assumption and reality. And more importantly, he saw where the truth had come from, not from the 7 people paid to know, but from the one person no one thought to ask. He stood up slowly, the movement drawing every eye back to him. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but decisive. We have been solving the wrong problem, he said, and no one interrupted this time, because they knew, at least in that moment, that he was right. The room did not erupt into argument the way it usually did when power was challenged. Instead, it shifted into something quieter and far more dangerous. A slow realization spreading across 7 executives who had built careers on being right, because now they were faced with the possibility that they had all been wrong at the same time. Mr. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, folding his arms tightly. We are not redesigning an entire strategy based on a casual user experience, he said, trying to regain control, but his voice lacked the sharp authority it had carried before. Ms. Klein added quickly, we have months of research behind this, millions of dollars invested in data modeling. She gestured toward the screen again, as if numbers alone could restore certainty. We cannot pivot based on anecdotal feedback. Ethan did not respond immediately. He walked slowly toward the screen, his gaze scanning the same charts that had looked so convincing an hour ago, but now felt incomplete, like a story missing its ending. It is not anecdotal if it explains the pattern, he said calmly, pointing to the dip Maya had mentioned. This is where we are losing them. The analyst who had checked the data earlier nodded almost involuntarily. Yes, the drop-off is consistent, he admitted, then quickly looked down again. As if he had said too much, the room shifted. Again, smaller this time, but enough to tilt the balance further. Ethan turned back toward the table, then toward Maya. If we remove that step, what happens? He asked, and this time, the question was not theoretical, it was direct, operational. Maya blinked slightly, surprised at the weight of the question, because it meant he was not just listening, he was considering acting. They keep going, she said simply. If it is easy, they finish it. She paused, then added, If they finish it, they trust it. That word lingered. Trust, not metrics, not conversion rate, but something more human, something harder to manufacture and easier to lose. Mr. Harris exhaled sharply. This is an oversimplification, he said, though his tone now sounded more defensive than certain. User behavior is complex. Maya nodded, not disagreeing. It is, she said. But people are not complicated when they are tired, or busy, or unsure. She glanced briefly at the coffee cup still untouched in front of them. They just want something that works the first time. Silence followed again, but it felt different now, less resistant, more reflective. Ethan looked around the table, meeting each executive's eyes one by one, not accusing, not confrontational, just measuring, and what he saw was hesitation, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they had built their thinking on distance, on models instead of moments, on projections instead of experience, and now that distance was being exposed. How many of you have personally completed the full process? He asked. The question simple, direct, unavoidable. No one answered immediately. A few shifted in their seats. One glanced at another, waiting for someone else to speak first, but no one did, because the truth was obvious without being spoken. Ethan gave a small nod, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he turned back to Maya. Walk me through it, he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt about who he was asking to lead. Maya stepped slightly closer to the table, not fully entering their space, but no longer standing at the edge of it either. She described each step as she had experienced it, not with technical language, but with clarity, with detail, with the kind of precision that came from actually doing it, not analyzing it. The first part is fine, she said. It is clear, quick. You know what to do. She moved her hand slightly as if tracing the path in her mind. Then step 2 asks for more information, but it still makes sense. She paused. Then her expression shifted slightly. Step 3 is where it breaks, she said. It asks for something most people do not have ready, and it does not explain why it matters. She looked at Ethan. So it feels unnecessary. The word landed with weight, unnecessary. The fastest way to lose attention, to lose patience, to lose people. The analyst was already typing now, pulling up more detailed data, his earlier hesitation replaced by urgency. There is a significant spike in abandonment at that exact point, he said, louder this time. Unable to ignore the alignment, Ms. Klein frowned, looking at her own screen, recalculating, adjusting assumptions in real time. Mr. Reynolds remained still, but his expression had shifted, the certainty gone, replaced by something more complicated, something closer to realization. Ethan absorbed all of it, the data, the explanation, the shift in the room. Then he made a decision, not slowly, not cautiously, but with the same clarity that had built his company in the first place. We are removing step 3, he said, his voice steady, final. We simplify the process, reduce friction, and test immediately. One of the executives opened his mouth to object, then stopped, because there was nothing left to stand on. The logic had already moved past them. Ethan continued. We do not need more reports, he added, glancing briefly at the stack of tablets. We need results. He turned back to Maya, and for the first time, there was something close to respect in his expression, not exaggerated, not performative, just real. You just saved us months of guessing, he said, and the room felt that too. The shift in recognition, the quiet recalibration of who mattered in that moment. Maya did not smile. She did not step forward. She simply nodded once, because she understood. Something they were only beginning to see, that insight did not come from position, and truth did not ask for permission. It just waited for someone willing to say it out loud. The decision did not echo loudly, but it moved faster than any argument in the room, because once Ethan spoke, the system followed. The analyst was already typing commands, pulling up live dashboards, rerouting simulations. We can deploy a simplified version within 48 hours, he said, his voice carrying a new kind of urgency, not fear, but focus. Ms. Klein leaned forward, her earlier confidence now reshaped into calculation. If we remove step 3, we will need to adjust onboarding metrics, recalibrate projections, update investor expectations. She was already thinking ahead, already adapting, because that was what survival looked like at this level. not stubbornness, but speed. Mr. Reynolds, however, remained still, his gaze shifting from the screen to Maya, then back to Ethan. We are restructuring a $200 million strategy based on someone who is not even part of this team, he said, quieter now, but still holding on to something, not authority, but pride. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not challenge him directly. He simply asked, did any of us catch this before today? The question landed clean, precise, and again, no one answered, because the answer had already been demonstrated. Ethan continued. Then she is more part of this solution than we are right now. That settled it, not because it silenced disagreement, but because it reframed the hierarchy of value, truth over title, insight over position. The room absorbed it slowly, adjusting, recalibrating. Maya stood where she was, not moving closer, not stepping back, her presence no longer invisible, but not fully accepted either. She could feel the shift, subtle but real, the way people looked at her now, not as background, but as disruption, and disruption always came with resistance. Ethan turned slightly toward her. What is your name? He asked, and for a moment, the question felt heavier than everything else that had happened, because it was the first time anyone in that room had asked it. Maya, she said, her voice steady. Maya Johnson. Ethan nodded once, committing it to memory. Maya, he repeated, then gestured lightly toward the table, not as an order, but as an invitation. Stay. The word shifted something again, because staying meant crossing a line that had always been clear. She hesitated, just for a second, then stepped closer, not taking a seat, but no longer standing at the edge. The analyst turned his screen slightly, so Ethan could see the updated flow. If we remove the friction point, projected completion rates increase by 30%, he said. His earlier hesitation gone, replaced by momentum, and if completion increases, conversion follows, Ms. Klein added, already integrating the new model into her thinking. The pieces were moving now, faster, cleaner, more aligned with reality than before. Ethan watched it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was not about being right. It was about correcting course before it was too late. Mr. Harris leaned forward, his voice lower now, more measured. We will need to communicate this shift carefully, he said. Investors are expecting a different narrative. Ethan gave a small nod. Then we give them a better one, he replied. One that actually works. The room almost smiled at that. Not fully, but enough to release some of the tension. Outside, the gray sky had begun to lighten slightly, the storm moving on. Inside, something similar was happening, a recalibration, a quiet restructuring of what mattered. Maya watched the screen as the updated projections began to take shape, numbers shifting, curves adjusting, not dramatically, but meaningfully. She did not fully understand every metric, every calculation, but she understood the direction, simpler, clearer, closer to how people actually move through things. Ethan noticed where her eyes were, not on the titles, not on the labels, but on the flow, the experience, and that told him more than any resume could. We are running a live test, he said, turning back to the team. No delays, no committees, we launch and measure. This time, no one argued because the logic had already shifted. They were no longer defending a plan. They were building a better one. The meeting moved forward, faster now, more focused. Assignments were made, timelines adjusted, responsibilities reassigned, and through it all, Maya remained there, not speaking unless asked, but no longer ignored. Her presence had weight now, not because of her position, but because of what she had already proven. As the room settled into this new rhythm, Ethan stepped slightly aside, just enough to stand next to her without making it a moment. How long have you been here? He asked quietly, not as the CEO, but as someone trying to understand. 3 months, she said. I work mornings mostly. He nodded, processing that. 3 months, and no one had thought to ask what she saw, what she experienced, what she knew from the ground level. The realization was not dramatic, but it was sharp. And no one ever asked you about the product, he said, more to himself than to her. Maya gave a small, almost knowing smile. No, she said. They usually just ask if I can make it extra hot. Ethan let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite frustration, something in between, because in that single sentence, There was another truth, not about the product, but about the system itself, about what it chose to see and what it chose to ignore. He looked back at the room, at the executives now working through a plan that had started with someone they had dismissed less than 10 minutes ago, and he knew, not as a guess, but as a certainty, that this moment was not just about saving a deal, it was about changing how decisions were made, who was heard, and what counted as valuable. And as the updated projection stabilized on the screen, no longer flashing loss but possibility, the real shift was not in the numbers, it was in the room, and none of them would be able to unsee it. The momentum did not slow once it started. It sharpened, focused, like a machine finally aligned with the reality it was meant to serve. Screens flickered with updated projections. Analysts moved faster. Voices became more precise, no longer defending old ideas, but building something new, something that actually fit the way people behaved instead of the way spreadsheets predicted they should. Ethan stood at the center of it, not controlling every detail, but guiding the direction. Run the simplified flow through the live environment, he said. I want real user data within 24 hours. The analyst nodded immediately, already executing the command. Ms. Klein adjusted her tablet, recalculating revenue curves in real time. If completion rates increase by even 20%, we stabilize within the quarter, she said, her tone no longer defensive but engaged, adaptive. Mr. Harris added, and if we pair that with clearer messaging, we can recover user trust faster than projected. The conversation had changed completely, not because the people had changed, but because the truth had shifted their foundation, and now they had no choice but to build on it. Maya stood quietly near the side, watching the room transform. She did not fully belong here, not yet, but she was no longer invisible, and that alone felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a space that had always been closed. One of the junior analysts glanced at her briefly, then back at his screen, then again, as if trying to reconcile what had just happened, because in every version of this room he had known, someone like her did not change the direction of a $200 million decision. But here she was, and the system was moving because of it. Mr. Reynolds finally leaned forward again, his resistance not gone, but quieter, more calculated. If this works, he said, choosing his words carefully, we will need to rethink how we validate assumptions going forward. It was not an apology, not even an admission, but it was a shift, and in rooms like this, shifts mattered more than statements. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging it without emphasizing it, because the real work was not in what they said, but in what they changed. He turned slightly toward Maya again. When you got stuck, he asked, what made you stay as long as you did before quitting? The question was different from the others, more specific, more human. Maya thought for a moment, then said, I thought maybe I was doing it wrong, she said, so I tried again. She paused, then added, but after a while, it felt like it was not made for me. That sentence landed deeper than any metric, because it revealed something numbers could not capture, not just where users dropped off, but why they stopped trying. Ethan absorbed it, connecting it to something larger, something beyond this single product. If people feel like something is not made for them, they leave, he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Maya nodded. Yes, she said simply. And they do not come back. The room fell into a brief silence again, not tense, but thoughtful, because now they were not just fixing a step, they were confronting a mindset, one that had been built into their process without anyone noticing. The assumption that users would adapt to the system, instead of the system adapting to the users. Ethan turned back to the screen, where the updated flow was now fully visible, cleaner, shorter, more direct. We design for reality, he said, not for ideal behavior. No one argued, because they had already seen what happened when they did the opposite. The analyst spoke again. Initial simulation shows a 40% reduction in drop-off at step 3, he said, then corrected himself. At the former step 3, a small, almost unnoticed adjustment, but it reflected the shift. The problem was no longer fixed, it was removed. Ms. Klein allowed herself a faint exhale, not relief exactly, but recognition. If this holds, she said, we recover the majority of projected losses. Ethan did not celebrate, did not react outwardly. He simply nodded once, because for him, this was not the end of a problem, it was The correction of a mistake that should not have happened in the first place. He looked around the room again, taking in the faces, the posture, the energy, and he saw it clearly now. The difference between before and after. Before, they had been certain, confident, aligned with their own assumptions. After, they were listening, adjusting, responding to something real, and that difference was everything. Maya shifted slightly, preparing to step back again, to return to the role she had come in with, because she knew how this usually worked. Moments passed, and systems returned to normal. But before she could move, Ethan spoke again, not loudly, but with intention. "You are not going back to pouring coffee after this," he said, and the room felt that too. The weight of it, the implication. Maya blinked, surprised, not because she had expected nothing, but because she had not expected this, not so directly. "I am just doing my job," she said quietly, not dismissing what had happened, but not claiming more than that. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "you did something none of us did." He gestured lightly toward the table, toward the screens, toward the entire structure that had just shifted. "You saw what we missed." The words were simple, but they carried a kind of recognition that could not be ignored. Mr. Reynolds looked at her again, differently this time, not with dismissal, but with something closer to evaluation, as if reassessing everything he thought he understood about who belonged in this room. Miss Klein closed her tablet slowly, her expression thoughtful. The analyst continued working, but his focus had changed. The entire room had changed, and in the center of it, standing between where she had been and where she might go, Maya felt the weight of something new, not just attention, but possibility, and for the first time since she had walked into that room, the question was no longer whether she should speak, but what would happen next because she did. The words did not settle gently. They lingered, stretching across the room like a line no one could step back from. Because once Ethan said it, it became real, not just a passing moment, not just recognition, but a shift in trajectory. Maya stood still for a second longer than she meant to, her mind catching up to what had just been offered, not in title or contract, but in direction, and that made it heavier, more uncertain. Mr. Reynolds leaned back again, this time slower, studying Ethan. Then Maya. Then the room, as if recalculating his position within it. "You are suggesting we bring her into the team," he said, not as a question, but as a clarification. Ethan did not hesitate. "I am saying we start listening to the people who actually experience what we build," he replied, his tone calm, but firm enough to close the gap between suggestion and decision. Miss Klein glanced at Maya again, her expression no longer dismissive, but analytical. "What is your background?" she asked. Not unkindly, but directly. Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she knew how it would sound in this room. "I did not finish college," she said. "I have worked different jobs, mostly service." She kept her voice steady, not apologizing, not explaining beyond what was necessary. A brief silence followed, not the sharp kind from before, but a quieter one, where assumptions were being tested against reality. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses slightly. "So you do not have formal training in product design or market analysis," he said, again not attacking, but defining the gap as he saw it. Maya nodded. "No," she said, then added, "I just used it." And that sentence, simple as it was, carried more weight than any resume in that moment, because it addressed the exact gap they had just uncovered. Ethan turned slightly toward the table, then back to her. "That is exactly the point," he said. "We have plenty of people trained to analyze. What we do not have is enough people who actually experience what we build the way our users do." He paused, letting that settle, then continued. "And we just saw what that costs." No one argued, because the cost was still glowing faintly on the screen behind him. Even if the projection had begun to shift, the memory of that number remained. The room absorbed his words, not fully comfortable, but unable to reject them. The analyst spoke up again, more confidently now. "The updated model is stabilizing," he said. "If early test results align, we are looking at recovering over $160 million within the next 2 quarters. A quiet ripple moved through the room, not celebration, but recognition, because that number was not theoretical anymore. It was within reach, and it had started with a sentence no one had expected to hear. Ethan nodded once, then looked back at Maya. You said you got stuck because it felt like it was not made for you, he said. What would make it feel like it was? The question shifted the focus again, from problem to design, from failure to possibility. Maya thought for a moment, her gaze moving, briefly to the screen, then back to him. Clarity, she said. Tell people why you need something, not just what you need. She paused, then added, and give them a way forward if they do not have it yet. She gestured slightly with her hand, as if outlining the path. Do not block them, guide them. The words were not technical, but they carried structure, direction, something actionable. Miss Klein tapped her tablet again, already mapping the suggestion into the flow. We can implement conditional paths, she said. Allow users to skip and return later, with prompts that explain value. Mr. Harris nodded slowly. That would reduce friction without compromising data collection. The pieces were aligning again, but this time, they were built on something different, something grounded. Ethan watched it all come together, then made another decision, one that extended beyond the immediate fix. We are creating a user experience advisory layer, he said, looking at the team, not as a formality, but as a requirement. He turned back to Maya. And you are part of it. The room stilled again, not in shock this time, but in recognition of what that meant, because this was not a temporary inclusion, not a one-time consultation. It was a structural change, a new way of deciding who had a voice. Maya felt that weight too, heavier than before. Because this was no longer about a single moment. It was about what came after. I do not know how to do what you do, she said honestly, not rejecting the offer, but acknowledging the gap as she saw it. Ethan gave a small nod. That is not what I am asking, he said. I am asking you to keep seeing what we miss. The simplicity of that reframed everything. Not a demand to become something else, but an invitation to remain exactly what had made the difference. The room held that for a moment. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the resistance that had been there earlier began to dissolve. Not completely, but enough to allow something new to take its place. Something built not on titles or assumptions, but on the recognition that value did not always look the way they expected it to. And as the updated projections continued to stabilize on the screen, the real shift was no longer about numbers. It was about who was allowed to shape them. And for the first time, that answer had changed. The shift did not announce itself with applause or celebration. It settled quietly into the structure of the room, reshaping how people sat, how they looked at each other, how they listened. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one was trying to prove they were the smartest person at the table. They were trying to understand what they had missed. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving the team space to continue. But his attention remained sharp, tracking every adjustment, every recalibration, because this moment was fragile, not in weakness, but in transformation, and transformation required consistency, not just a single realization. The analyst spoke again, his voice steadier now. We are pushing the simplified flow into a controlled user group, he said. Initial feedback should begin within the next few hours. Ms. Klein nodded, already aligning communication strategies. We will need to prepare messaging that reflects ease of use, clarity, and accessibility, she said, her earlier tone of authority now grounded in something more responsive. Mr. Harris added, and we should monitor user sentiment closely, not just completion rates, but how people feel about the process. That word again, feel. It had not been part of their vocabulary before, not in this room, not in this context, but now it was, and that mattered. Maya stood there, absorbing it all, not overwhelmed, but aware that the room was changing faster than she could fully process, because this was not just about one idea being accepted. It was about an entire system opening to something it had ignored for too long. She could feel eyes on her, not all of them welcoming, some still skeptical, some uncertain, because change did not erase bias overnight. It just exposed it. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat again, his voice measured, careful. If we are formalizing this advisory layer, he said, we need to define its structure, its boundaries, its accountability. It was not resistance, not exactly, but it was an attempt to bring the unfamiliar back into something controlled, something predictable. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the concern. We will define it, he said, but we will not limit it to what makes us comfortable. The distinction was subtle, but clear, and it shifted the tone again. Maya noticed it, not in the words, themselves, but in what they allowed, because for the first time, the system was not trying to fit her into its existing shape. It was adjusting to include what she brought, and that was new, unfamiliar, and a little uncertain. Ethan turned toward her again. You said clarity matters, he said. If you were explaining this process to someone who has never seen it before, how would you do it? The question was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not about fixing a problem anymore. It was about defining a new approach. Maya thought for a moment, then spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. I would tell them what they are getting before asking them to do anything, she said. Not just what the steps are, but why they matter. She paused, then added. And I would show them that they are making progress, not just moving through screens. She gestured lightly. People need to feel like they are getting somewhere, not just giving information. The analyst nodded immediately. Progress indicators, simplified language, fewer assumptions, he said, already translating her insight into action. Ms. Klein added. And we can test different messaging variations to see which builds trust faster. The conversation flowed now, not from hierarchy, but from alignment, each piece building on the last, and at the center of it, Maya's perspective continued to shape the direction. Not because she spoke the most, but because what she said connected to something real. Ethan watched it all, then made another quiet adjustment. From this point forward, he said, looking at the team, no major decision moves forward without direct user perspective. He did not specify what that looked like yet, did not formalize it into policy, but the intention was clear. The room absorbed it, not resisting, but adapting, because they had already seen the cost of doing otherwise. Maya felt the weight of that again, not as pressure, but as responsibility, because now her voice was not just heard, it was expected, and that changed how she stood, how she thought, how she spoke. Mr. Harris glanced at her once more, then back at Ethan. We will need to rethink how we gather that perspective consistently, he said. And this time, it was not a challenge, but a contribution, a recognition that the system itself needed to evolve. Ethan gave a small nod. We will build it, he said, then looked back at Maya, with people who actually live it. The phrase landed differently than anything before, because it was not about expertise in the traditional sense. It was about experience, about proximity to reality, and that was something the room had underestimated until now. The screens continued to update, numbers stabilizing, projections improving, but the real change was not in the data, it was in the process, in who was included, in what was valued. And as the meeting moved forward, no one said it out loud, but everyone understood it in their own way. The system had just been rewritten, not by a plan, not by a report, but by a single perspective that had been overlooked, and the question that lingered, unspoken but present, was not whether it would work, but how many times they had missed something like this before without even realizing it. Time did not slow down after the decision. It accelerated, because once a system begins to correct itself, it demands proof, not theory, and within hours, the first signals began to come in, small at first, almost easy to ignore if they had not been looking for them. The analyst leaned forward, eyes fixed on the live dashboard. We have early user activity, he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet urgency. Completion rates are increasing. The room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to pull everyone's attention back to the screens. Numbers refreshed in real time, percentages climbing slowly but consistently. Not a spike, not a miracle, but something far more important, a pattern. What is the delta? Ethan asked, his tone calm, but focused. 32% increase in completed flows compared to the previous version. The analyst replied, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, pulling deeper metrics. And session time is shorter, which means less friction. Ms. Klein leaned in, scanning the data, her expression tightening not with concern, but with recognition. Shorter time and higher completion, she said. That means users are not struggling. They are moving. She paused, then added, almost to herself, they are not quitting. That word again, but now it carried a different weight, not loss, but recovery. Mr. Harris adjusted his posture, watching the numbers stabilize. What about drop off at the previous friction point? He asked. The analyst nodded, already prepared. Reduced by 41%, he said, then looked up. It aligns almost exactly with what Maya described. The room absorbed that, not as a surprise anymore, but as confirmation, because this was no longer about believing her. It was about seeing the result of what she had said. Ethan did not react outwardly, but his gaze moved briefly toward Maya, acknowledging without exaggeration, without performance, just a quiet recognition that what she had brought into the room was now measurable, real, undeniable. Maya stood still, watching the numbers change, not celebrating, not claiming anything, just observing, because for her, the shift had never been about the data, it had been about the experience, and now the two were finally aligned. One of the executives who had remained mostly silent until now spoke, his voice lower, more thoughtful. User feedback is coming in as well, he said, reading from his screen. Comments mention that the process feels easier, clearer, less confusing. He paused, then added, some are even saying they would recommend it to others. That sentence moved through the room differently than the numbers, because it was not just performance, it was perception, and perception was what turned users into advocates. Ethan nodded once. That is what we needed, he said, not as a celebration, but as a confirmation of direction. Mr. Reynolds remained quiet, his earlier resistance now replaced by something more complex. He was not fully convinced, not fully comfortable, but he could not deny what was in front of him. If this continues, he said slowly, we are not just recovering losses, we are strengthening the product beyond its original projection. It was not an admission of being wrong, but it was a shift toward acceptance. And in a room like this, that mattered. Ms. Klein closed her tablet briefly, looking at Maya again, this time without analysis, without evaluation, just recognition. Your insight changed the trajectory, she said, not dramatically, not emotionally, but clearly, and that clarity carried more weight than praise. Maya met her gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly, not stepping into the recognition, but not stepping away from it either, because she understood something they were still processing, that this was not about her being exceptional, it was about them finally listening to something they had always had access to but never valued. Ethan turned back to the screen, watching the numbers stabilize further, then spoke again. We are scaling the update, he said. Full rollout begins tomorrow. There was no hesitation in his voice, because the data had already answered the only question that mattered. The analyst nodded, already preparing the deployment sequence. We will monitor continuously, he said, and adjust if needed. The system was moving now, not cautiously, but confidently, because it was no longer built on assumption, it was built on reality. Maya shifted her weight slightly, the room feeling different around her now, not because everything had changed, but because something fundamental had. She was no longer just someone who brought coffee into the room. She was part of what moved it forward, and that realization did not feel like power. It felt like responsibility. Ethan noticed the way she stood, the way she watched, not the screens, but the flow, the experience behind the numbers. And he understood something then, something that went beyond this moment, beyond this product, beyond this single decision. This is not a one-time fix, he said, turning back to the team. This is a new standard. The words settled into the room, not as pressure, but as direction, because standards shaped behavior, and behavior shaped outcomes. Mr. Harris nodded slowly. Then we build systems to support it, he said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no resistance, just alignment. Because they had already seen what happened when they did not. The screens continued to update. The numbers continued to improve, but the real shift was no longer in the data. It was in the way the room functioned, and who was heard, and what was valued. And as the meeting moved forward, quieter now, more focused, more real, one thing became clear to everyone there, not all at once, but enough to change how they thought going forward. The most important insight in the room had not come from the people with the most experience, the highest salaries, or the strongest titles. It had come from the person they had almost asked to leave, and that was something none of them would forget. The room did not return to what it had been, because once something true is seen, it cannot be unseen, and the shift that had started with a single sentence had now spread into every corner of the space, shaping not just decisions, but behavior, tone, even silence. The meeting moved forward, but it no longer felt like a presentation. It felt like a recalibration. Ethan stood near the screen, watching the live data stabilize into something no longer uncertain, but promising. What is the Projected recovery if this trend holds over 72 hours, he asked. The analyst responded without hesitation. If consistency remains above 30% improvement, we recover approximately $180 million within the next quarter. A subtle pause followed, not disbelief. But wait, because that number carried consequences, not just financial, but structural. It meant that everything they had assumed before had been incomplete. Mr. Harris exhaled slowly. That would not just offset the loss, he said. It would position us ahead of where we expected to be. Ms. Klein nodded, her earlier rigidity replaced by something sharper, more adaptive. And it would strengthen investor confidence significantly, she added. Especially if we frame this as a strategic refinement rather than a correction. Ethan did not interrupt, but his expression suggested something different. Not disagreement, but a shift in priority. We frame it as truth, he said simply. We listened, we adjusted, and it worked. The room absorbed that, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was not just about messaging. It was about direction. Maya stood quietly, her eyes moving between the screen and the people in the room, observing not just what was being said, but how it was being said, because she could feel it, the difference between before and now. Before, they spoke to defend, to justify, to protect their position. Now, they spoke to understand, to adapt, to move forward, and that difference was everything. Mr. Reynolds finally leaned forward again, his voice no longer resistant, but thoughtful. If we continue like this, he said, we will need to rethink how we build teams. It was not a challenge, it was a realization, and that made it more powerful. Ethan gave a small nod. We already are, he said, his gaze briefly moving toward Maya, not spotlighting her, but acknowledging her presence as part of that change. One of the younger executives, who had remained mostly silent throughout the meeting, spoke up cautiously. We could implement structured user panels, he suggested. Bring in people from different backgrounds to test early versions, Ms. Klein added, and integrate that feedback into development cycles, not just post-launch adjustments. The ideas were flowing now, not from hierarchy, but from alignment, each one building on the last, shaped by the same realization. That distance from the user was not strength, it was risk. Maya listened, absorbing it, not as an outsider anymore, but not fully as an insider either. She was somewhere in between, a bridge between two perspectives that had not met before. Ethan noticed that too. The way she did not interrupt, did not dominate the conversation, but when she spoke, it shifted everything. What would you test first? He asked her, bringing the focus back. Maya thought for a moment, then said, the first impression, she replied. What people see in the first 10 seconds, she paused, then added. Because if that does not make sense, nothing else matters. The analyst nodded immediately. We can track engagement within the first 10 seconds, measure drop-off at entry points, he said. Already adjusting the metrics, Mr. Harris added, and simplify the initial messaging even further, reduce cognitive load. The room moved with her words, not because they were complex, but because they were clear, grounded, real. Ethan watched it all, then made another quiet decision. We are documenting this process, he said. Not just the changes, but how we got here. The room stilled slightly, not because they did not understand, but because they did. This was not just about fixing a product, it was about redefining how decisions were made. We make this part of our standard, he continued, so we do not repeat the same mistake. Ms. Klein nodded slowly. Institutional learning, she said, almost to herself. We build it into the system. The words carried weight, because systems outlast individuals, and this moment was becoming something larger than any one person. Maya felt that too. The shift from moment to structure, from insight to expectation, and with it came a new kind of awareness. Not just that she had been heard, but that what she had said would continue to matter, beyond this room, beyond this day. Ethan turned slightly toward her again. You said people quit when something feels like it is not made for them, he said. What makes something feel like it is? Maya did not answer immediately. She looked at the screen, at the numbers, at the flow, then back at him. When it respects their time, she said, and does not make them feel like they are doing something wrong. She paused, then added, when it feels like someone thought about them before they built it. The sentence settled into the room, deeper than any metric, because it was not about design, It was about intention, and intention shaped everything. No one spoke for a moment, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood what it meant, and as the data continued to update, the projections stabilizing into something no longer uncertain, but strong, the real shift was not in the numbers, it was in the way they now saw the people behind them, not as data points, not as segments, but as individuals, and that changed everything, because once you see people that way, you build differently, you decide differently, and you lead differently, and in that room, without anyone announcing it, that change had already begun. The room no longer felt like a place where decisions were made by rank. It felt like a place where reality was finally allowed to enter, and that changed everything about how the next moments unfolded. The screens continued to update in real time, the numbers no longer climbing slowly but holding steady, consistent, reliable. The analyst leaned forward again, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that had not been there before. "We are past the initial spike," he said. "User behavior is stabilizing at the higher completion rate." He tapped the screen lightly, highlighting the trend line. "This is not a temporary reaction. It is a pattern." Ethan nodded once, not surprised, but confirmed, because this was what happens when something actually works, not just in theory, but in practice. Miss Klein studied the updated projections, her expression focused, sharp. "If this holds through the next 24 hours, we exceed recovery expectations," she said, then paused, recalculating. "We could potentially surpass original projections by 10%. A subtle shift moved through the room again, not excitement, but recognition, because this was no longer about saving something. It was about improving it beyond what they had planned. Mr. Harris leaned back slightly, his earlier caution replaced by measured confidence. "Then we are not just correcting an error," he said. "We are strengthening the model." Ethan turned slightly toward him. "Only because we stopped assuming we were right," he replied, and that sentence settled deeper than any metric, because it reframed the entire outcome, not as success, but as correction. Maya stood where she was, watching the data move, but more importantly, watching how the people in the room responded to it, because numbers could change direction, but behavior revealed whether the change would last, and what she saw now was different. They were not rushing to claim credit, not repositioning themselves as the ones who had seen it all along. They were adjusting, listening, integrating, and that mattered more than any projection. Mr. Reynolds spoke again, but his tone had changed completely. No edge, no resistance, just clarity. "We built a system that filtered out the very perspective we needed," he said, not looking at anyone in particular, but acknowledging something larger, something structural. Ethan nodded slightly. "And we are fixing that," he said, not as a promise, but as a directive. One of the analysts pulled up a new set of feedback data. "User comments are increasing," he said, "and they are consistently positive." He read a few aloud. "Easy to follow. Finally makes sense. I actually finished it this time." The words were simple, but they carried weight, because they reflected something real, not curated, not filtered, just honest. Maya listened to them, not with pride, but with recognition, because she had been that user. The one who almost quit, the one who felt like it was not made for her, and now she could hear the difference, not just in the numbers, but in the experience behind them. Ethan looked at the screen for a moment longer, then turned back to the room. "We are moving forward with full integration," he said, "not just for this product, but across all user-facing systems." The room stilled slightly, because that was bigger than a fix. It was a shift in how the company would operate. Miss Klein nodded slowly, already thinking ahead. "We will need to align all departments," she said. "Product, design, marketing, customer experience," Mr. Harris added, "and redefine our development checkpoints to include direct user validation." The ideas were building now, not from pressure, but from alignment, because they had seen what happened when they did not include that perspective. Maya felt the weight of that again, not as pressure, but as expansion, because what had started as a single moment was now becoming part of something larger, something that would continue beyond this room. Ethan turned toward her once more, his expression steady, focused. "You said people need to feel like something is made for them," he said. "How do we make sure we do not lose that as we grow?" The question carried more weight than the others, because it was not about fixing a problem, it was about preventing it from returning. Maya took a moment before answering, not because she did not know, but because she understood what was being asked. You keep asking people like me, she said. Simply, directly. Not just once, not just when something breaks, but all the time. She paused, then added. And you listen before you decide. The room absorbed that, not as a suggestion, but as a principle, something that would need to be built into how they worked, not just what they produced. Ethan nodded once, the answer aligning with what he had already begun to see. Then we build that into the system, he said. And this time, it was not a reaction, it was a commitment. The screens continued to update, the projections holding strong, the recovery no longer uncertain, but real. But the most important change was not on the screen, it was in the room, in how decisions were being made, in who was being heard, in what was being valued. And as the meeting moved toward its close, not with finality, but with direction, one thing was clear, not because anyone said it, but because everyone felt it. The company had not just avoided a loss, it had discovered something far more valuable, a way of seeing that had always been there, waiting to be recognized, and now that it had been, nothing about how they moved forward would ever be the same. The meeting did not end with applause or closure. It transitioned, quietly, deliberately, like something that had shifted too deeply to simply stop. The screens remained active, data still flowing. But the urgency had changed. It was no longer about reacting. It was about reinforcing what had just been discovered. Ethan stepped away from the head of the table, no longer positioned above the room, but within it. And that alone altered the energy again, not authority reduced, but distance removed. We are not walking away from this as a success, he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying across the room without effort. We are walking away from this as a correction. The distinction mattered, because success could be repeated without understanding, but correction required awareness, required change. Ms. Klein nodded slowly, absorbing the shift in framing. Then we document not just what worked, she said, but what we missed, Mr. Harris added. And why we missed it. The conversation moved naturally into something deeper, less about performance, more about structure, because the numbers had already proven the outcome. Now they needed to understand the cause. Maya stood quietly, listening, not because she had nothing to add, but because she was watching how the system responded when it was forced to confront itself, and what she saw was different from what she had expected. There was no immediate attempt to minimize what had happened, no effort to reframe it as something they had already known. Instead, there was a willingness, cautious but real, to acknowledge the gap. Mr. Reynolds spoke again, his tone measured, reflective. We built layers of validation that confirmed our assumptions instead of challenging them. He said, not defensively, but analytically. We trusted the process more than the outcome. Ethan nodded once, and the process was designed without enough proximity to reality. He replied, the words simple, but precise. The analyst pulled up a new set of internal metrics, not user data this time, but process data. Our validation loops rely heavily on aggregated feedback, he said. Not direct experience, Ms. Klein added, which means we are filtering out the very signals that would have revealed this earlier. The realization deepened, not dramatic, but steady, like something being rebuilt from the inside. Maya shifted slightly, not stepping forward, but no longer at the edge either, because she understood now that this was not just about her moment. It was about what came after it. Ethan turned toward her again, not to highlight, but to include. If you had been asked earlier, he said, would this have been obvious? Maya thought for a moment, then answered honestly. Yes, she said. Not everything. But that part. She gestured lightly toward the screen, toward where the friction had been. It stood out right away. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, but heavy with implication, because that meant the problem had not been hidden, it had been overlooked, and that was harder to accept. Mr. Harris exhaled slowly. Then the issue is not complexity. He said, it is visibility. Ms. Klein nodded. And access, she added, who we choose to hear from, and when. The room absorbed that, not as criticism, but as direction, because now they had something to build from. Ethan looked around the table again, his gaze steady, deliberate. We are changing how we define expertise, he said, and the words settled into the room with weight, not because they were loud, but because they were final. It is not just what you know, he continued. It is how close you are to the reality we are trying to serve. No one argued, because they had already seen the cost of getting that wrong. Maya felt that shift more than anyone, not because it elevated her, but because it validated something she had always known without having the language to explain it. That experience mattered. That perspective mattered. Even if it did not come with credentials. Ethan turned slightly toward her again. You said earlier that people feel when something is not made for them, he said. What made you stay long enough to notice the problem instead of leaving immediately? The question was different, more personal. Maya paused, considering it, then answered quietly. I needed it to work, she said. So I kept trying, she added. But most people would not. The honesty of it landed deeply, because it revealed something beyond design, beyond process. It revealed the difference between persistence and expectation, between someone who pushes through and someone who walks away, and the system they had built had relied too heavily on the former. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the implication. Then we design for the person who leaves, he said, not as a suggestion, but as a principle, not the one who stays. The room absorbed that, not as a limitation, but as clarity, because it shifted the entire perspective from optimizing for ideal users to serving real ones. The analyst adjusted the model again, incorporating the new approach. If we reduce reliance on persistence, he said, we increase accessibility across all user segments, Ms. Klein added, which expands our market reach beyond current projections. The pieces continued to align, not forced, not theoretical, but grounded, real. Maya watched it all, feeling the weight of something she had not expected when she walked into the room with a tray of coffee. Not just that she had been heard, but that what she had said was now shaping something larger than herself, something that would continue long after this moment ended. Ethan stepped back slightly, looking at the team, at the screens, at the structure that was already beginning to change, and he knew, not as a prediction, but as a certainty, that this was not the end of a problem. It was the beginning of a different way of seeing. And as the meeting moved forward, quieter now, more grounded, more real, one thing became clear to everyone there, not all at once, but enough to stay with them. The most valuable insight in the room had not come from the people with the most authority. It had come from the person closest to the experience, and that was not something they would overlook again. The room did not feel like a boardroom anymore. It felt like a turning point that no one had planned, but everyone now understood. And as the final sets of data stabilized across the screens, something else settled with it. A quiet certainty that what had just happened would not stay contained within this moment. The analyst leaned back slightly, hands resting on the keyboard, as if even the system had reached a pause. We have sustained performance across all active segments, he said, his voice steady, almost calm now. No regression, no instability. He glanced at Ethan, then added, this is holding. That word carried weight, because it meant the change was not temporary, not fragile. It was real. Ms. Klein nodded slowly, reviewing the final projections. Then we are not just recovering, she said. We are redefining the baseline. Mr. Harris closed his tablet gently, not with finality, but with understanding. And we did it by removing complexity, not adding to it. Ethan stood still for a moment, taking it in, not the numbers, not the success, but the process that had led there. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but more certain. We built something better the moment we stopped trying to sound right, he said, and no one in the room challenged that, because they had all felt it, the difference between sounding right and being right. Maya stood where she had been for most of the meeting, but everything around her had changed, the way people looked at her, the way they listened when she spoke, the way her presence now carried weight, without needing to prove it. And yet she had not moved closer to the table, had not taken a seat, because she understood something they were only beginning to learn. That position did not define impact. Ethan turned toward her again, not as a formality, not as recognition, but as continuation. If you had walked out when they told you to, he said, what would have happened? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Maya thought for a moment, then answered honestly. You would have kept going, she said, and the problem would still be there. A quiet silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective, because it revealed something deeper than the outcome. It revealed how close they had come to missing it entirely. Mr. Reynolds shifted slightly in his seat, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful. "We almost dismissed the only perspective that mattered," he said, "not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, and that acknowledgement carried more weight than any apology." Ethan nodded once, not emphasizing it, but not letting it pass unnoticed either. "That is why this cannot be optional," he said. "Listening is not a step in the process. It is the process." The words settled into the structure of the room, not as a statement, but as a new standard, MS. Klein looked at Maya again, this time with something different in her expression, not analysis, not evaluation, but respect. "You did not just point out a flaw," she said. "You changed how we think about what we build." Maya met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the screen, because for her, the impact had never been about recognition. It had been about making something work the way it should. The analyst pulled up one final set of data. "User retention is already improving," he said, "and feedback indicates higher trust in the process." The word trust appeared again, not as a concept, but as a measurable outcome, and that was something none of them had prioritized before. Ethan stepped forward slightly, looking at the screen one last time, then back at the team. "This is what happens when we design for people, not models," he said, and this time, the statement did not feel like a correction, it felt like a foundation, something they could build on moving forward. Maya shifted her weight slightly, the room now quieter, more settled, but not finished, because something had begun here that would not end with this meeting. Ethan turned toward her one last time, his expression steady, clear. "You are not here by accident anymore," he said, not as an offer, not as a favor, but as a recognition of what had already been proven. "You are here because you see what we do not." The words were simple, but they carried a permanence that changed everything. The room felt it too. The final shift from moment to structure, from exception to expectation, and as the screens dimmed slightly, the data no longer demanding attention, the real focus moved back to the people in the room, to what they had learned, to what they would carry forward, and in that quiet space, without anyone needing to say it out loud, one truth remained clear: the value that had saved everything did not come from status. It came from perspective, and now that they had seen it, they could never go back to the way they had worked before. The room did not empty the way it usually did after a high-stakes meeting. No one rushed out, no one checked their phones, no one tried to reclaim control with side conversations. Instead, people lingered, not physically stepping away, but mentally staying within what had just happened, because it was not just a decision. It was a shift that had rewritten something deeper than strategy. Ethan stood near the window now, the city stretching out beneath him, no longer gray, but clearing, light breaking through the clouds in a way that felt almost aligned with the moment. Behind him, the screens had dimmed, the data no longer urgent, no longer demanding attention, because the outcome had already been set in motion, but what remained was more important. What would come next? Maya turned slightly, her hand brushing lightly against the empty tray she had set down earlier, the object that had brought her into the room, now feeling like something from a different moment, a different version of herself, one that had been invisible just an hour ago, and she could feel it. The difference, not just in how others saw her, but in how she stood, how she thought, how she understood her place within this space that had once excluded her without question. Ethan turned back toward the room, his gaze moving across each person, not to assess, not to measure, but to confirm that they had all felt it, that none of them had missed what this moment meant. "This does not end here," he said, his voice steady, grounded, not loud, but impossible to ignore. "What happened in this room is not an exception. It is a correction we should have made a long time ago." The words settled, not as pressure, but as direction, because everyone there understood the implication. This was not about one product, one decision, one success. It was about how everything would be done moving forward. Miss Klein stepped forward slightly, her posture different now, less rigid, more open. "Then we formalize it immediately," she said. "We build user perspective into every stage, not as feedback, but as foundation." Mr. Harris nodded. "And we ensure it is not filtered through layers that distort it," he added. "Direct, unmodified, real." Mr. Reynolds remained still for a moment, then spoke, his voice carrying a clarity that had not been there at the beginning. "And we hold ourselves accountable when we ignore it," he said, not as criticism, but as commitment. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging each of them, because this was how change became real, not through agreement, but through ownership. Maya listened, her presence no longer tentative, but steady, grounded, and for the first time, she stepped forward, not because she was asked, but because she had something to add. "If you want to keep seeing what you missed," she said, her voice calm, clear, "you have to keep asking people who are not in this room." The sentence landed with the same quiet force as the first one she had spoken, because it carried the same truth, not complicated, not dressed in language, just real. Ethan met her gaze, a faint recognition in his expression, not of surprise, but of confirmation. "That is exactly what we are going to do," he said, and this time, it did not feel like a response. It felt like a continuation of something that had already begun. The room held that for a moment. Then slowly, people began to move, not rushing, not breaking the moment, but carrying it with them. The analysts saved the final data set. Ms. Klein closed her tablet with intention. Mr. Harris gathered his notes, but none of them returned to who they had been before walking into that room. Because something fundamental had shifted, not just in what they knew, but in how they would know things going forward. Ethan stepped closer to Maya, not as a CEO addressing an employee, but as someone acknowledging another perspective that had changed everything. "You did not just help us fix a problem," he said quietly. "You showed us where to look from now on." Maya nodded slightly, not stepping into the weight of the statement, but understanding it, because she knew something they were still learning, that this perspective was not rare, it was just often ignored. Ethan glanced briefly at the tray, then back at her. "You can leave that here," he said, not dismissing the task, but releasing her from it. And in that small moment, something symbolic shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but clearly. She was no longer defined by what she carried into the room, but by what she brought to it. Maya let her hand fall away from the tray, a quiet acknowledgement of that shift, and as she stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer invisible, the room around her felt different, not because it had changed for her, but because it had changed with her included in it. Ethan turned back toward the door, pausing for a brief second before leaving, and when he spoke again, it was not to the room, not to the executives, but to the space itself, to what it now represented. "Next time," he said, his voice calm, certain, "we start by listening." And with that, he stepped out, not ending the moment, but carrying it forward, because what had begun in that room was not something that could be contained. It was something that would continue, in every decision, every meeting, every product they built from that point on. And as the door closed softly behind him, one truth remained, clear, undeniable, and impossible to forget. The difference between failure and success had not been intelligence, experience, or status. It had been perspective, and now that they had finally seen it, they would never ignore it again.